Oh my goodness, real life events. I'm so excited. So can we get started, AV folks? Good to go? Cool. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to this in-person as well as online event for Melbourne Conversations. Just a little bit of housekeeping, which is that if you need the loo at any point, it's just out through the back there and to the right. And obviously, if you need to go, just go, no stress. And also one other quick disclaimer just to start the event, which is we have to say this for legal reasons. Nothing we are saying here constitutes financial advice. We'll do our best to talk to you as humans, but obviously we have to be really careful not to tiptoe into that financial advisor space. So to open, I would like to welcome everyone and do a quick acknowledgement of country. On behalf of the City of Melbourne, I respectfully acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, the Boon Wurrung and Wairong Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and emerging, and especially welcome any folks who are traditional owners of the land who are here today. So, welcome to Melbourne Conversations, the Ethics of Investing. This event is part of the Melbourne Conversations series run by City of Melbourne on the third Wednesday of every month. You can submit your questions if you have any for our two wonderful speakers. Unfortunately, we had a third who has gotten stuck at the airport and she won't be joining us today, which is a real pity. That's Maryam Mohammed. She's a financial educator for particularly women who are immigrants or women who are not English first speakers. And she's doing really excellent work in the education for finance space, but she's stuck and can't make it. But we have two absolute sources of knowledge here to my left, so we'll have plenty to talk about, I'm sure, and it won't be a problem. And yes, if you do have any questions for them, we will have some time at the end of the discussion, or of the talk rather, where you can submit those questions. It's up on Slido. I don't know if you've seen Slido before, but it's a website. You literally type in sli.do, and you can submit your questions there, and you have to pop in a hashtag. That hashtag is ethics of investing, all one word. And because we are both a digital and an in real life event, we won't be taking questions directly from the audience to try and be fair to the folks who are online watching on YouTube as well. So if you do have any questions, just feel free to grab your phone out and pop them up there. And we also will have some more questions if we don't get some from the audience. Also, if you want to see any other events or talks from the Melbourne Knowledge Week, you can hop onto YouTube. There is a channel which has all the Melbourne Conversations events recorded, so after the fact you can go check them out or listen in live. Today, we're going to talk about investing, conscious consumerism, and ethics. We've got two amazing panelists, Nicole Haddau and Carly Hammond. And as I mentioned, unfortunately, Maryam Mohammed won't be able to join us today. I'm Laura Summers. I'm your moderator for the event. I'm a design engineer, which is a bit of a silly nothing term, but it means I do both design and programming, and I work in natural language processing at the moment. But I'm actually very interested in how we improve our decision-making as technologists, specifically to make more responsible, more thoughtful tech that anticipates potential future consequences or unintended impacts. I'm also the designer of this little card pack we're going to use later. It's called Ethics Litmus Tests, and they're a set of card prompts that help us get outside our head and interrogate ethical scenarios when we're a little bit stuck. The term ethical investment might feel a little bit like a contradiction in terms, but increasingly, it's something people are asking for. And today, we're going to be exploring this question of how achievable it actually is. Especially in lieu of what we might wish for, which is strong government policy to guide our markets and to enforce limits on corporations around issues of sustainability and the use of fossil fuels. We see people increasingly asking themselves how they can drive the change that they want to see in the world. So this is our opportunity to talk about the force of consumer demand, both as individuals and as a collective, and how we let perfect not be the enemy of better. So I'd like to start by inviting Nicole to chat to us. Nicole Haddau is a Victoria-based journalist and author of The Ethical Investor, How to Quit Toxic Companies and Grow Your Wealth. She's also the author of Smashed Avocado, How I Cracked the Property Market and You Can Too, both published by Black Ink Books and available in all good bookstores. And she's also a journalist and a financial writer and very thoughtful about this like big and deep topic. So welcome, Nicole, and perhaps give us your thoughts on how we can be ethical investors.
Absolutely. So thank you for that lovely introduction, Laura. I started my financial journey when I was 30, which is probably quite late to start thinking about money. And it started with me looking to buy an investment property, which is what Smashed Avocado is all about. But once I'd sort of completed that journey, I then needed to start looking at my finances beyond property. So, thinking about my banking, my superannuation, perhaps investing in shares. The first big thing for me was my superannuation. When I started on this path to becoming more ethical, I called my existing superannuation fund and I said, "Can you tell me where my money's invested?" And they couldn't tell me, and I just found that quite staggering. Whether they couldn't or whether they wouldn't, didn't really matter to me. This was my nest egg, and I thought, how are Australians? If you've got a job, you've got a super fund, you are an investor. How are we not getting access to the information? We need to make critical decisions about not only our financial future, but whether we're comfortable with the way that big organisation is investing our money.
Do you have a sense that not revealing the companies that go into a portfolio is the norm in investing in super or other kinds of investing, or is that sort of an exception of that particular company?
Well, when I spoke to that company, they said, look, this is our secret sauce, our secret recipe. If we reveal that information, then other companies will know how we invest. That might have flown, a decade or two ago. But as consumers become more conscious and products become available that are so transparent, that's no longer going to be enough, in my view.
Yeah, I find that a confusing argument as well, but I'm not an investor, so perhaps there is some kind of secret sauce, but wouldn't the amounts that, the mix of how much is in which company or in which investment tranche sort of be more the secret sauce and less which individual companies?
Absolutely. I can't see any reason why these companies wouldn't want to say, here's where we're investing. If they're great companies, if they're exciting companies, I do wonder if the reason they're not putting this information out there is that perhaps if consumers get their hands on it, they're not going to be very happy about it.
Right, the dust under the covers version of marketing.
Correct. I mean, I eventually got my top 10 holdings, but there was hundreds of companies in that portfolio, presumably. So not knowing makes that, a real challenge in terms of deciding whether I want to stay or go.
And we were just chatting backstage before the event started a little bit on this thing that we all feel as people who care about ethics and outcomes, that when we're making decisions as consumers and decisions as individuals, there's like always this sense that it's hard to be good enough. It's hard to get it right in every single decision. So maybe I'll invite you to muse a little bit on that as well, like this challenge of going from, not wanting to deal with it and just kind of like avoiding the issue to like starting to engage with the questions and then giving yourself permission to not be perfect on every single thing.
Yeah, the getting permission to not be perfect, getting that permission from myself was really difficult, and initially it caused me quite a bit of anxiety because if we're looking at super as a starting point, there are so many companies in that bundle, and making sure that everyone is perfectly ethical to the standards that I'm trying to uphold. Was pretty anxiety inducing, and I had to reach a point where I thought, okay, starting and moving the needle and trying to do well and being more aware is better than not trying at all.
Yeah, that's very wise words. It's a lot, and there's a reason that investing is a full-time job, because being really hyper aware of what every single corporate is doing is certainly beyond the time and energy of any individual investor.
Absolutely.
And let me invite our second panelist. Carly Hammond is the head of marketing and impact investment forum program manager for the Responsible Investment Association Australasia. She is also a non-executive director for B-Lab Australia and New Zealand. Carly is a passionate advocate in promoting profit with purpose. and believes that the private sector holds enormous power and potential to help deliver the world we want to see and live in. So welcome, Carly, and I'm also just going to give you a blank slate to talk about what you think of ethical investing.
Thanks, Laura. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land we're on here today, here in Melbourne, the Wurundjeri people. I guess what's got me to be here today is a long history in marketing, where I've always wanted to whatever I'm marketing to be making the world a better place. And my early days, I started off at Lonely Planet, which was founded by the same people that are responsible for bringing this Wheeler Centre that we're in today, but then moved across to not-for-profits. So worked in aid and development sector and in the environmental sector as well. And those organisations still are doing phenomenal work, but I guess what I kept rubbing up against was this feeling that it was still a band-aid on these big systemic problems that really only both government policy and corporate action could fix. And so slowly I gravitated across really to looking at where I could be in a role that was influencing the activity of companies. And with that, what guides companies the most is the investors backing them. And so that took me on a journey to now be with Responsible Investment Association Australasia, otherwise known as RIA. And so I guess, there's lots of entry points for people wanting to think about, how to align their values with their money. But I guess the first thing that I really wanted to reiterate is that you're not alone, and this is a growing movement. Day by day, we're seeing those numbers just increase of people wanting information and tools. And as Nicole would know, with the success of her book too, RIA does annual research in Australia, where we launched it last month, showing that 4 in 5 Australians actually expect their superannuation and their banking to be invested ethically and responsibly, which is a really high number. Interestingly, 3/4 of the population say that they would move their money if they found out it wasn't being invested in line with their values. So whether that all manifests or not is another thing, but definitely the intention is there to increasingly to align the two. And we've seen that just with our numbers and the amount of money that's moving into this space. So again, we do annual research into the amount of growth that we're seeing in this sector and the composition of that growth. And what we saw that last year was, even though markets didn't grow overly, money is moving out of the traditional funds into the responsible investment funds. It had 15 times the amount of growth into the responsible and sustainable investment sector than the remainder of the market, it's huge.
Can you contextualize that for us? I don't really know much about, the last 40 years of Australian super, but can you think of any other phenomenon where you'd see that much change in terms of the shift in where people are putting their investment funds, their investment money? Is this a once in a generation event, a couple times? I'm just curious, because it sounds like a very, very significant shift.
I think it's a tipping point. It really is. And there's all different factors. I mean, there's an increasing amount of people putting out, organisations putting out responsible and ethical options as well. So part of RIA's job is to really sort through that, to say, well, these products have integrity. Not so sure about the rest of them. But yeah, we're seeing a proliferation of products as well. And I just think, and this is probably my second most important point, is that what we're also seeing year after year is performance is telling a story as well. And I'm certainly not here to give anyone financial advice, but what I will say is that we see year after year that responsible investment funds either perform on par or outperform traditional investments, and often that's outperforming. Now, you're still going to have bad investments in the mix. Every investment product is different. but that's really compelling. So I think, years ago we were fighting, as a communications specialist, we were fighting this whole myth out there that you're going to lose out financially if you do that.
It's your wallet or your tree hugging, but you can't have both.
Yeah, you can't have both. And I think people are realising now that often you can.
So maybe let's go back to basics, because we're sort of talking about these terms of ethical investing or responsible investing, but I think perhaps it's good to start with just the straightforward, what do we mean when we say ethical investing, and whose ethics are we talking about, and how can we, move from our personal intuitions of what might be acceptable to looking at a product and saying, well, that matches or that doesn't match, or that meets my expectations or doesn't. Because it can be, in fact, you have a great example from your book of the woman who was the researcher at Peter Mac, who spent her life fighting cancer, and particularly lung cancer, and then found out that she had significant money invested in her super and a tobacco product, I think. And that was really shocking to her. So let's go back to basics. Like, what do we mean when we say ethics, and how do we kind of bridge that gap between my intuitions about ethics and an actual product in the world?
I mean, in my experience, it was a case of working out what my ethics were in an investment context. So, it had been a long time since I'd thought about, where my ethics would lie. I think a lot of the media and the narrative currently around ethical and sustainable investment is focused very heavily on climate change and fossil fuels, and that's really important. But there are so many things that you might consider to be either unethical or ethical. So for me, it was a case of sort of and a lot of investment organisations will do this as well. Screening, what am I comfortable with? What am I really happy with, and what's an absolute no for me? But for me, when I started digging, it was really a case of looking beyond just renewables, and of course that was a space that I was certainly keen to play in. But looking at how that organisation is running, is there good governance? Is the supply chain ethical? It's really, really complex when you get into it. But when you're starting out, I would say look at the sectors that you are interested in seeing thrive. For me, a major one is aged care. There's a lot to be done in the aged care space in Australia. It's a growing space, and I think there's a lot of potential. And so I'd like to where possible, explore those kinds of opportunities. So that's kind of where my thinking went, but it's certainly not linear. I mean, Carly, do you have a view on how better to define it?
I can easily go down an industry rabbit warren of all the different terms that we, talk about, the kind of alphabet soup where you've got ethical and sustainable and responsible. Historically, the birth of this whole movement has come very much in the ethical investment space, being about avoiding industries. So, very much about screening out companies and screening out industries. And
perhaps you could describe the difference between negative and positive screening, because that might be a concept that folks aren't so familiar with.
Yeah, and I think nowadays there's not many investors who are just screening out. You'll probably find, if you're at the kind of greenwashing end of things, you might find a product that calls itself responsible or ethical that's really just screened out tobacco companies maybe, and ammunitions or something like that. But it's interesting because if they're investing in the Australian Stock Exchange, there's no tobacco companies anyway there. So that would be a really good example of greenwashing. But positive screening, it's pretty much exactly the opposite. It's saying, okay, well, we really want to invest in clean energy solutions or affordable housing or aged care solutions, and deliberately picking industries and companies that are tackling a social issue or a social challenge, and we'll see a bit of that these days. But I guess the point that I wanted to make was that a lot of the mainstream providers don't call this space ethical. They don't want to kind of brand their products as ethical, because there's this idea that ethical is very much a personal thing. So they'll tend to use more kind of sustainable and responsible language, and not kind of do it for the moral reasons, but do it actually, again, more on the financial side, that it's just simply not compelling financially to be investing in certain dirty industries. So yeah, it is an interesting space with those different terms.
The term ethical and moral both, I think, have a little bit of uncomfortable tangling with concepts of religion and religious cultures, and that could be positive or negative depending on who you are and what your background is. So I can understand corporations having a bit of discomfort sort of engaging.
But the interesting thing is that if you ask anyone walking down the street what's the term that they gravitate towards that tells this story of this sector and what people want to be doing with their money, it's ethical.
Because isn't it ultimately doing the right thing? I mean, and the sustainable label doesn't tell that whole story.
It doesn't.
I think that's the challenge.
Agreed.
When people think sustainable, they think environment, and that's great, and it's obviously an important place to be considering. But doing the right thing can mean so many different things. It can mean paying your staff properly, and I think the challenge is, you touched on it there, the idea of greenwashing. That was the challenge that I faced when I started looking into organisations to invest in, to find out how a company runs, to really look under the hood and understand that is really difficult. And a lot of companies are getting really good at creating the marketing that says we do the right thing. But then if you read the financials and drill down a little bit further, you realise maybe that's not the case. I mean, what can people like me do to get better at identifying those things?
Yeah, I mean, I think as you talked about earlier, this whole kind of, it's called portfolio holdings disclosure in a formal context, but it's basically saying, okay, so if we talk about our super fund, for example, what companies are you invested in, and increasingly you'll get that information. I mean, Australia's one of the worst countries in the world for making that mandatory, but they have, at the end of last year, finally made it mandatory, but it's still going to be limited in terms of what kind of level of information that they're going to have to give. But that does give a really good sense. I mean, you'll see pretty quickly, okay, are they in Coca-Cola, or are they in Facebook, or are they in Rio Tinto? In terms of knowing whether the companies themselves are okay, I guess that's a decision whether you want to do that deeper research around that. There's a lot of companies that it is now their bread and butter to go out there and research these companies and to give them scores. So every super fund will be using one of those companies that will provide a score on how well company A is doing with regards to its environmental performance, its social performance, its governance structures, and so forth. And the super fund will therefore make decisions on the basis of that. It's pretty hard to take that into our own hands, but I think, at the end of the day, we all have, if I ask you about Nike, you'll probably have an opinion. And, I think that's probably important to go with your own knowledge and opinion. You don't need to know everything. You can just get a feeling of, well, if they've got several companies in their portfolio that I feel really uncomfortable with, maybe they're not for you. But what I would say is don't let get perfect get in the way of getting started, because it's pretty likely that there'll be the odd thing in there that you'll raise your eyebrows to. And I think just getting on the bandwagon is more important, and getting a feel for things over time. If you aim for the most perfect product, you may not get it.
And to be fair, once you're invested in it, you can ask them to improve their mix, or you can give them your opinions about what you would like to see. But if you don't own any of that product or that stock or that ETF, which is a type of product which can give you little bits of shares in a whole bunch of different companies, and if you don't have anything, you've got no skin in the game, and equally that company offering that product has no responsibility to you to improve it.
And that's right. And I think a really important thing to understand when we talk about negative screening, positive screening, what I haven't talked about is corporate engagement or shareholder engagement. And that's the strategy by which the investor keeps their shares in the company. So a recent example is Australian Ethical, which is a super provider and a fund manager, and they've had shares in Lendlease. Lendlease is doing a development in Sydney where there's a local koala population, like quite a significant koala population. And so they've been engaging with Lendlease around what kind of steps Lendlease can be taking to better protect this population. And so what you'll find is there's countless examples that we're seeing now. So Rio Tinto is another one where you've got a whole lot of investors now putting a lot of pressure on Rio Tinto as shareholders to do more around Indigenous heritage protections. I mean, I think, the jury's still out whether it will improve things, but interestingly now Aussie Ethical is saying they might divest and take their money, i.e. negatively screen out Lendlease because they're not getting the traction that they want by their shareholder engagement. So I guess the point is shareholder engagement can be a really important tool. So it's not about being black and white. If you see that they've got stocks in there and companies that you go, oh, I really don't like them, try and find out what they're doing with that company because they might be really engaging quite heavily to change things.
And certainly that carrot versus stick approach could potentially achieve the outcome you want. And, when you think about investing as an individual for your whether it's individual shares or your super fund or where your mortgage is at, your individual money may seem like, oh, it's not very much or it's not going to move the needle. And that's why working with bigger companies that have these big sets of funds under management can really sort of amplify the power of your choice. Because if they're saying, well, hey, Lendlease, we're going to take our money away from you, and that's quite a significant chunk of cash, that's much more painful than me as an individual saying, oh, well, I'm not going to buy the 10 shares I was going to buy as part of that stock portfolio or as part of that super fund product.
And what we're seeing now is investors, the big investment houses of the world are getting together as well. And so there was an example last year where this is actually a small investor that owned shares in ExxonMobil. I think they raised a motion potentially at their AGM where they wanted an overhaul of the governance structure because they felt that the ExxonMobil's non-executive directors were not with the times with regards to climate change risk and what it meant for the bottom line. And so this small investor got together, got the support of very big investors to support this motion that ended up with 3 of the directors getting kicked out because they were not progressive on climate change. Now, again, we're going to have to see, well, how does that translate into the business policies and actions that make it a cleaner company? But it's a really good start, and that would not be possible from investors or a super fund that's not invested in ExxonMobil. So
yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, certainly I think, you might have 2 major directions you can think about driving change. One is making change from the inside, and the other is trying to get the companies you don't like to die and, invest in the companies that you want to see in the world. And I think perhaps a mature way of thinking about it is that, we need both. We need to both engage with those big corporates and try and encourage the growth of the ones we want to see. If you've just joined us, my name is Laura Summers, and you're watching Melbourne Conversations, The Ethics of Investing. So hi, folks online, just in case you've just hopped onto the stream. If you did want to pop in any questions for our panelists, you can do that at Slido, that's sli.do, and enter the hashtag ethics of investing. And there's also a QR code if you're on the YouTube link. I can see there's a bunch of great questions coming through, so we'll keep going and get to those soon and try and get through as many as we can. And I wanted to run a little activity just to have some fun today. So we're going to do a scenario. We're going to offer a sort of ethical scenario that anyone might imagine themselves facing as they're trying to improve their finances, invest more ethically, invest in things they care about. And so what we're going to do to play with ethics litmus tests is I'm going to offer the scenario and then pull a card, and then I'm going to invite our panelists to respond to the scenario, sort of using this card as a way of interrogating or prompting some conversation. Does that sound okay? Yeah, hopefully? Cool. All right, so here's the scenario. You're an individual and you want to move your super money. So this is, I think, a thing that lots of folks are thinking about or may have just done. They're thinking, where can my super go so I feel better about it, so I feel like it's investing in things I care about? And you've narrowed it down to two options. You could move to a different investment product in your existing fund. It's called Green Balance. Do you think it's pretty good for your risk appetite? Or you could move it to a different super fund. And this was one that was specifically set up and established to provide more ethical and more sustainable investments. The pros and cons are your existing fund, it's bigger, it's got more funds under management, it's got more history. So this is kind of a thing we talk about with super. You look at the sort of past performance. It's not, the common disclaimer is past performance does not predict future performance, but it certainly gives you an idea of how they've done in the past. And it can be scary to invest in a newer company that may not have so many years of investment returns to look at. So this is the quandary. Like, do you stay with your existing fund knowing that they do have lots of options that are investing in fossil fuels, investing in those traditional companies you may not love, and just move into one of their greener, more sort of sustainable options? Or do you take a chance and try this bigger company? And drum roll, please. I'll pull out a card to prompt our conversation. Should have pulled these out in a second. All right, so. I don't like that one. Okay, never mind. Don't like that one. Nope, don't like that one. I'm not getting any. Here we go. Here's a great question. Imagine your best self. What would they do? So that's our prompt, and we've got our scenario. Carly or Nicole, who would like to go?
I think it depends on how old your best self is.
Great question.
A lot of things that will be a factor in this decision making will be where your risk profile sits. I am in my late 30s. I have time to keep earning money, keep adding to my super. So I might be prepared to take that risk. In fact, I have recently taken that risk. But that is a result of not only considering doing the right thing, but also thinking about where I am in my financial point in life. Because obviously you want to do the right thing, but you don't necessarily want to do it to the detriment of your financial health. So, in my case, being where I am, probably working for the next 30 years or so, I can take that risk. If I was approaching retirement, I might be looking at things a little bit differently.
That's an interesting question. So what age is your best self? I mean, if your best self is 7, then she has all the time in the world.
I love that. I'm glad you went first. I mean, when I was hearing that, I've always been less about the finances. My best self is much more about heart, and so I instantly go to, well, I want to be with the organisation that it's their purpose. So it's not just about a product on the side. So what you'll find is there'll be, if we're talking superannuation, you'll find all different kinds of superannuation funds, but it's fairly common now to find super funds that have an ethical option as a side product. And then they kind of do business as usual with the rest of their products, I guess. That's actually changing over time now, again, because of the financial imperative, that it's actually wiser to roll out a lot of that across your whole portfolio rather than in just a specific ethically branded product. But for me, I'd be looking more for the organisation that it's in their DNA and their purpose to be making a positive impact on the world alongside the financial returns. But I would also...
Now I feel like a really bad person.
No, but that's only because you went first. But you gave me the licence to say that, because I think that has to be a factor. That's absolutely implicit what you've said.
Yeah, I think the great thing is there are a lot of organisations out there now that didn't exist, even 5 years ago. So the challenge is there are going to be risks associated with choosing that organisation that is doing things with heart, because they don't have the history of returns. But absolutely that DNA, having that purpose in their DNA, is amazing. And it's amazing that there's that option available now for consumers, because there just wasn't the range of choice that there was.
And I think, again, back to baby steps here, like it's obviously easier if you're with a certain fund to move into an ethical option as a first step. It's really, really easy to move super into different options, and even to move super funds. So that could be a first step to get you familiar with it, and then you can watch this other fund that you're interested in over the next couple of years as it develops a track record before you jump in there. So I think you can almost have your cake and eat it over time.
That's a really good point. And we think about super as this long-term investment, and not about, did it do well in 6 months or in a year, but how is it tracking in the long term? And arguably, if you take climate science seriously, and if you care a lot about divesting from fossil fuels, and you're worried about the state of the climate, if we're thinking about our super, I'm similar to you in age. I'm in my early 40s, and I'm thinking of working for another, 20, 25 years. And if climate goes really badly, there won't be jobs, there won't be an economy, or there'll be, climate catastrophes and climate refugees. So arguably, if you take those warnings seriously, you might be more comfortable with taking the risk because you think it's the lower risk in terms of the possible futures we could be facing. And yeah, certainly if I was to ask my best self, I think it would be to try and do the brave but scary thing in hopes that it bears fruit, as opposed to do the less scary thing, but then possibly be less confident in driving change. And I totally agree with you, Carly, that when we see these funds and these corporations doing like kind of the side hustle green option, it feels like they're not maybe giving it as much attention as it needs. And we've talked a lot about how much work it is to really screen companies, understand their corporate structures, understand their governance, understand their supply chains. There's a lot of work to do there. So you can imagine how hard that might be to achieve if you only have a small number of investors in a small amount of time to kind of attend to those questions.
But the good thing is, even if your fund only does have that, you're sending them a signal that says, I really care about this as well. And I think over time that also influences them to roll out products or strategies across their whole portfolio as well.
But it's not just super. We're talking a lot about super, for the purpose of these big meaty examples. But was it you saying to me last week, Laura, that you wanted to move your mortgage?
Yeah.
And the banks are like, what do you mean? Why? And it's
because
I don't like how you're investing.
I asked my existing bank, what I've been with them for 10 years, and I was with them because when I came to Australia, my nana was like, oh, I'm with X. And I was like, okay, I guess I'll go with X. Like every good Australian family just follows what their parents do. And then eventually, I was looking at refinancing for a renovation, and I asked them, hey, is there any way for my money not to invest in these aspects of your portfolio I don't like? Like, you put a lot of money into coal projects. I really don't want that to happen. Is there any way for me to even see how your investments work as a bank? And their answer was like, really, they had nothing for me. And I basically said to them, well, hey, I was already thinking about moving, and that's kind of confirmed it for me. Thanks.
I'd be really interested to know what the numbers are like in terms of people moving banks, because I think banking is a really important thing to touch on. You can't necessarily just move banks. If you've got a loan, whether that be a personal loan or a mortgage or whatever the case is, you can stay with that organisation and hold them to account. But I'm pretty sure that there'd be quite a few people, everyone I talk to, especially at the moment, talking about ethical investing quite frequently, someone will tell me, yep, I'm moving or I've moved.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's most of us don't have a lot of money in our normal savings accounts compared to, say, super, but it's actually the more kind of administrative. It's tougher because you've got to change all the payees and so forth. So I've recently just got a mortgage for a new house, and we got finance with an ethical bank, a bank that I was really happy with, and then they put the rates up, and then we bought the house, and then they were no longer competitive, and it was like, oh, I really want to have a mortgage with a bank that has got good ethics, and luckily I ended up finding another ethical bank that met my rate, was better rates. But that was an interesting quandary because that's where the rubber really hits the road. If you're locked into, or you're with a mortgage for 30 years, obviously you can change it, but you don't want to be grossly out of pocket with something like that either.
You don't want to be paying like a really severe green tax, right? You don't want to be
That's right.
ending up at the end of your career with like significantly less money because you've paid more tax more interest on your loan over time because your rates were significantly less competitive than the market.
But I think, again, that comes back to, whether you've got a financial advisor or you're not, if you are thinking about exploring home ownership, as hard as it may be, then you'll at some point be talking to an advisor or a mortgage advisor. And I can't tell you how many mortgage advisors I've said, well, I'd like this bank and this bank and this bank. And they say, sorry, they're not on my books. And it's like, then we found one and she had them all. And so I think that's where sometimes you might need a different mortgage advisor who can help you and isn't just always with the big four. But knows a little bit about this space.
You can go directly to the bank as well, but the challenge is, a broker will kind of have more of those organisations on their books. But the other thing to think about, and I say this from my own experience, I had an aspiration to be with a particular bank, and currently at this time I can't achieve that because I've been a freelancer and a contractor, and my financial situation is a factor. So again, I just reinforce the message that wanting to do the right thing can take time. And for me, there's been a lot of, I'm not doing well enough, but even having it on my radar, even talking about it, these big banks are saying, well, people are really making serious considerations around the ethics of the way we run our business, which wasn't happening.
Yeah, and it's a really good point to flag for everyone that there is a lot of financial privilege inherent in these conversations, right? Like if you have the money to start a mortgage or to refinance a mortgage, that implies a certain level of financial freedom and success. Same with having any significant money in super. But even if you're a young person and, you have very little savings and, you just have a bank account, that can even be the first place to make a difference. And you can talk to your parents, you can talk to other folks who already have some more cash or some more money and, try and sway their opinions. Like I want to encourage people to not feel disheartened if they don't have a big sum themselves that sort of is their consumer vote. There's lots of ways we can think about trying to move the needle for our networks, for our friends and families, as well as for our own money.
The other thing That's right. The other thing I'd say on that is if you are starting out with a small amount of money, is there are a lot of micro investing apps out there. I tried quite a few when I was researching the ethical investor, and you can start with spare change. You can round up money. You can set up your account to buy a $4.50 coffee, and that extra 50 cents then goes into your portfolio. There's a couple of things that happen there. You get to understand how these portfolios work. You get to learn before you're investing huge amounts of money. But you're also doing your little bit by choosing a product that you believe in. And I wouldn't want people to be put off because they think, I don't have thousands, I can't start. You can learn, and that kind of education piece makes a huge difference as well.
Yeah, and it maybe makes you more confident for when you have a bit more cash to invest or you think about the next step with your finances.
Yeah.
We have so many great questions rolling in, so I'm just going to flag again. If you did want to add any more, you can go to sli.do, sli.do, and type in ethics of investing. You can also vote on the existing questions if there's any you want to see hit our speakers, because we probably won't get through all of them. But let's just jump in, because they're quite fun. So this is probably one for Carly. Is there a particular term for impact investment that specifically focuses on existential threats to humanity?
Wow.
I'm glad that's for you.
No, I mean, impact investing, again, is very much about positive screening. So impact investing is when you're deliberately saying, well, we are, with our investments, we're going to focus on these various different issues. So you may want to focus on, say, disability housing, for example, and we'll invest in solutions to that, and then we'll measure what difference you're making as an investor and report back to, I guess, the people that are investing in your product. So impact investing, I would say, is the most potent kind of sustainable investment strategy that you can do. And that's where you see really kind of rich results, you know, people living with a disability who you can actually measure the change in their lifestyle and those outcomes that have benefited them. Or, you know, similarly, it might be renewable energy where you can actually measure the positive contribution that you know, a wind turbine or a solar installation has actually made. But in terms of the question about existential threats, I mean, I think climate change is a big focus for, you know, if we're talking existential, it's a big focus for impact investors. But in some ways, it's an easier one to finance because there's assets that are out there that people can, you know, we're seeing a proliferation of renewable energy infrastructure out there that's available to investors. I think some of the harder ones are how do we invest in mental health and that aren't necessarily based around an asset as much. And
How do I invest to prevent Elon Musk buying Twitter? That feels like an existential threat to me. I mean, I'm being cheeky, but yes, of course. Like these are hard questions, like things that need to be driven by government policy or things that are about international cooperation, like not having nuclear war. How do I invest to get that? I don't know if there's a way.
Yeah, I mean, I think like refugees is that there's a whole network out there of impact investors that are investing to support refugees, whether it's helping them set up businesses when they arrive in different countries. There's so many really interesting investment themes that you can invest in, I think. And I guess part of the challenge is how do we bring that to the public? Because often that's happening at a more kind of highbrow institutional level, but it is happening, which is great.
Let's try and hit some of these others. I've got a really juicy one here, which I'm very into. Hi, I would love your thoughts on how Marx's critique on owning the means of production and profiting from others' labor could be applied to owning shares. And I think that's some juicy socialism for the conversation.
I don't have an answer specifically to that question, but I did have a conversation just yesterday with the idea of mum and dad investors, or the bank of mum and dad now being the biggest bank in the country. And, you know, I just can't quite get my head around the fact that people born at a particular time who've worked very hard, admittedly, and have built this incredible wealth are now passing that wealth on to the next generation and extending the wealth gap, essentially. That doesn't answer the question at all. So,
no, it's an interesting one. I mean, instantly I kind of go to the world of cooperatives and credit unions, which are essentially not-for-profit structures where the members all have a stake in the organisation. And I think that's probably more aligned than you know, I guess a more traditional kind of corporate structure. So certainly, you know, again, if we go back to the banking and home loan space, there's so many really interesting credit unions in Australia that are owned by their members.
And this sort of feels like a topic that often gets, hidden or overshadowed by some of these other bigger investment questions. But if you'd been with one of the big four banks and you were looking at a credit union, like, is this are they safe? Are they stable? Is it something that you can move your money to them and feel confident about it? Like, you might have people sort of just unaware that they're there, or not sort of sure how safe it is to move their money.
I mean, I guess that's a personal thing for people to look in, but the ones on the top of my head have been around for decades. They've got a track record.
So, yeah, pretty okay then. Yeah, I mean, look, it's an interesting thing to think that, you don't have to be with a big institutional bank and that's actually a choice. We sort of often see these things as defaults, hey? All right, well, Marx's critique, are he owning the means of production? I think, we do live in the world of a couple of big billionaires and a lot of very large corporations owning, big swathes of the means of production. Can we even up the power by having our own shares in those companies? Can we, perhaps somewhat rebalance the scales by doing the sort of corporate, ethical drives for action, as you mentioned with the one with BHP, like moving some directors out because they weren't progressive enough? Like, I think the answer is yeah.
I mean, are you aware of the Australian Centre for Corporate Responsibility?
No.
So that's ACCR is their acronym, and they are essentially about launching shareholder resolutions. So if you and I have shares in Wesfarmers or Woolworths, whatever we have shares in, you can get in touch, and what you do is you hand over your voting power to ACCR. And what they do then is they look at the most pertinent issues around our biggest companies, and then if they've got 100 people with shares in that company, they can launch a shareholder resolution. So they've done quite a number of resolutions, particularly with the mining sector in Australia. So that's a really interesting one. If you do, I've also been trying to get my mum to hand over she's got a few shares in big Australian companies. Can she hand over that I guess that proxy to ACCR, because that's what they're doing. They're very much focused on how do we use shareholders as a force for good to drive change.
There's several questions that are asking around things like how do I understand the issues that impact investing funds or are addressing, or how can I pick the best ethical options in microfinancing? And so I'm just trying to summarize a couple of these questions because we're going to run out of time. Can either of you suggest ways for folks who want to either do like individual investing or move banks or move supers, like any resources to help them assess their options? And also, are there any frameworks, guidelines, regulations for assessing, whether it is what it says on the box, whether it is that green or it is that sustainable?
I think just in terms of the greenwashing question, the ACCC has identified it as a priority that they want to, regulate a little bit better, or in terms of the claims that people are making about products. And certainly RIA's certification program around financial products, you won't get certified unless the certification team can verify that what you're saying is in fact what you're doing with your investment approach. Similarly, ASIC, so they've identified greenwashing as an issue, so we're still yet to see what's going to roll out with that and what they do in that space. RIA, my organisation, has a website, responsiblereturns.com.au, where you go and you select what kind of issues you care about in terms of things you want to avoid your money investing in, and then what kind of issues, positive themes, you actually want to engage around. and then whether that's for your banking or your super, and then you'll get a list of different funds and products that match those interests and areas. I think, where to start, what do you feel passionately about? Because most people will feel a bit more strongly about something versus something else. I mean,
That's
obviously
where I started, yeah.
climate's a big one for many people, but not for everyone. Like some people, for them, it's actually animal welfare is the issue that. But if you're maybe thinking more around aged care, that might be the issue, as you said. So maybe just start with something, and something like responsible returns can provide you with a bit of a bit of a signpost of different directions to go in. Market Forces also have a similar site for superannuation. It's only focused on fossil fuels, but again, it will just give you a bit of food for thought.
So yeah, if you want to just divest your super from fossil fuels, that's a website that sort of shows you how each of the funds are doing. Yeah,
Correct.
Yeah. And I think that's right. I spoke to one woman who, her passion, she was a vegan, and she wanted her investments to be aligned with that. She had a huge challenge in finding, investments that were strictly vegan. So she went down the path of investing in individual companies that she could be really, really confident in. That took a lot of research and a lot of effort. So again, I would say, don't let perfection be the enemy of starting, because it can be really difficult to achieve, whatever your niche aspiration might be, whether it's sustainable fashion or veganism or, whatever you're trying to do. But I think products are getting better all the time. And I think as the regulations get better and as the products that are available get better, we'll be able to find those little things that we're looking for.
And hopefully we'll see, as Carly was mentioning, more regulation, more clarity on the labeling. So if you say green, it has to mean X, Y, and Z, and it's not just some pretty marketing term. I'm going to just try and offer one last one before we wrap up. I think this is a really interesting question, and I don't really know the answer. Is it a problem that enterprises like that seem unethical, or are collectively not seen as doing very good in the public opinion, are bought by private equity and then get to evade public scrutiny by not being on these public markets?
I mean, it's a really good question.
It's a great question, and we certainly see that in the tobacco space, where majority of the fund managers these days won't invest in tobacco. So you could argue that it's out of scrutiny. You could say the same thing about coal when you see different, I think BHP a couple of years ago spun out one of its coal businesses, so it was no longer attributable to BHP, but it's still there. I mean, I think that's a really valid point. I think over time, history does tend to, it depends whether you're in it for the long term as well, because I think that coal business might still be profitable right now, but if you've got a long-term view, it probably won't be in whether it's 10, 15, 20 years. Again, it depends on the industry a little bit, but it is a valid question.
Did you want to add anything, Nicole?
I think sin stocks have been around forever, and whether they're on the stock exchange or whether they're held privately, this is the nature of the world. There's going to be businesses out there that do evade public scrutiny and continue to run because they generate a profit. I think it's very easy to forget that what we're talking about here essentially is business. We're talking about making money, and money makes the world go round, and there are going to be people, who hold that money, and it's potentially in the wrong hands. But this is not going anywhere. There will always be good business and bad business.
I think often the cost for them, though, in seeking finance can go up. I mean, you've seen that with Adani and in the port project. As they've gone from investor to investor into investor, it's become a lot harder to get the finance that they need. So it certainly does make some difference.
So even if we can't sort of take away their funding on a direct mechanism, at the very least we get to remove their social right to operate, their social approval, by changing, the Overton window and changing what is acceptable business behavior. And we have-
There's also, sorry, I mean, and that's where you can look down supply chains. So if you're invested in a supermarket, they're selling tobacco. So if you really want to go gung-ho on that as an industry, then you look at the distribution for some of those things as well.
I'm really sorry. I want to keep adding to this, but we need to wrap up because we're in our last few seconds. So thank you so much, Nicole and Carly, for joining me and for having this conversation. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this Melbourne Conversations event. City of Melbourne runs these events every third Wednesday of the month, so you're welcome to come back for the next one. You can see details of future events by searching Melbourne Conversations on the City of Melbourne website. And if you want to rewatch this or check out the other conversations, pop onto YouTube and subscribe to this Melbourne Knowledge Week channel to stay up to date with Melbourne Conversations. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you so much for all those wonderful questions, and have a good day.